It's time to look at some of the elements of design that make up good infographics. Now, after all, infographics are not much more than information presented graphically. So first we have to look at the first part of this, the info part of the infographic. And that has everything to do with data. And we're going to tackle these things as we go, but the first thing we'll start with is data. Now, it's important to make your data accurate, but maybe it's even more, well, I don't want to say more important. It's equally important to make it interpretable and comparable. And by that, I mean we need to normalize our data. One of the easiest mistakes to make when trying to convey data is to forget to create a basis for comparison by normalizing your data. And what that means is making your numbers directly comparable. For example, if I were to tell you that the total number of murders in 2012 in Chicago were 506, and the total number of murders in New York were 419, you'd roughly conclude that you're about as likely to be killed in Chicago as you are in New York City in 2012. They're both dangerous places, according to this graph. But when you take into consideration the fact that New York City has almost 4 times as many residents as Chicago, it paints a very different picture. And so you can normalize the data here and look at murders per million residents in 2012. And now you see that there are 187 murders per million residents in Chicago versus only 51 in New York. Now, you could even normalize this further and say that you have um, a 99.995% chance of living in New York City and not being murdered, whereas in Chicago, you have a 99.981% chance of being just fine living in Chicago. When you normalize out to consider not only the total number of people, but then to give a sense of how many people that actually is and how an individual fits into that whole, you start to see that these murder rates are actually not as scary as they might be made out to be in these charts. Normalization is the reason we have price per pound on grocery items in stores. Which one is a better value? Well, you don't really know unless you can normalize your data. If someone asks you which is heavier, 17 grams of flour or a pound and a half of flour, you would have to know how many grams are in a pound. 453 if you're curious. So using consistent units of measure and making sure to contextualize your data is really important to making it easily comparable, making it easily understandable. Now, once you have your data normalized, you're going to want to make sure that you convey it in an appealing way, and this is where we bring in the graphics part of infographics. So we're going to look at a few ways to convey your data. These are the hard numbers that you want to get across that might be confusing as just text. Now, the standard ways to visually represent data are the following. Charts, such as these. Scatter plots, pie charts, bar graphs, fever charts, and histograms are all slight variations off of the same principle of trying to fit data points in relation with other data points. And so depending on what you're trying to convey, whether you're trying to convey a trend or a part out of a whole, or whether you're measuring discrete or continuous amounts of data, you can think back to any maybe statistics 101 type classes you've had in your past as far as what chart or what graph would be the most appropriate for your data. You're going to have different options here to try and get that across. In addition to these charts, you might find maps are a useful way to convey data. And I want to quickly go through some of the differences in these maps. For example, you might at first glance be most familiar with the locator map. And the locator maps are the ones down in this bottom right corner where when you go onto a campus, such as the College of St. Elizabeth, and you're trying to figure out where the dining hall is, you look at a locator map which says you are here and the dining hall is this way and this is how to get there. That's the most typical sort of map. But you may have seen many of these other types of maps on television. For example, dot distribution maps or choropleth maps, which can tell you the location of where things occur, the location of certain points of data, or the rates and frequencies within a given region for that data. Or if those rates or frequencies or those locations of occurrence transcend region and they move across boundaries, you might see something like an isoline map, say on the Weather Channel, for example. But sometimes, less frequently, you'll see these very strange maps where the geography of the map is actually distorted to accommodate and best represent the data itself. And these are cartograms. So in this example down the bottom left, these are all the most popular tourist destinations, but the size of the country is scaled in relation to the frequency of tourism. So the most popular tourist destinations are larger, as if they take up more of the world. Um, this is what the world would look like through the eyes of tourism. This is sort of an extreme example. We don't usually see such heavy distortion on maps. But let's look at a more common example. Your everyday subway map, say for New York City, we might at first glance think that this is a locator map, right? It tells you where things are in a given region and how to get from point A to point B, and it labels things, and it looks, for all intents and purposes, like a campus map. But if you really look closely, you start to realize that this actually isn't at all what New York looks like. Several people have undertaken to try and create a geographically accurate subway map for New York City, and this is what they get, which does not do much in the way of ease of communication for how to get from point A to point B. If you zoom in, it just turns into spaghetti. It's informative, but it's not very easy to comprehend. And so what they've done is they've actually gone back and reshaped the geography of the land to help make the data come across in a more streamlined and easily intelligible and easily usable way. And so we have the modern subway map for Manhattan that we're so accustomed to now. We take for granted that that's not actually how Manhattan looks, nor how the subways are actually routed. And the third way to visualize data is often through diagrams. Diagrams are really useful when you want to depict a scene or an object with added information superimposed. This is almost like augmented reality before augmented reality existed. This is when you blow apart an item to show how it's made, or you label the pieces of things, or you label how something is constructed or will be constructed. So diagrams can be really useful ways to show an immense amount of data and how it fits into a real physical space. Now once you have all these pieces in place, you have to start to design them. And so the first thing that we might think of is color. Color is really important, and it can make or break your infographic, even before you start to look at the data. The most important thing is infographics, above many other design forms, need vivid contrast. They need an easily recognizable and easily readable contrast of colors that pops off the screen and helps you see the words and the numbers as clearly as possible. Oftentimes, these common colors that can facilitate this are complementary color schemes, and you see the blue and the orange down at the bottom. This allows for a lot of contrast. It's also visually, it sort of vibrates and has a little bit extra pop to it. But you also see a lot of sort of light and subtle colors, cream colors. And thanks to people like our friend Nigel Holmes, blue and these cream colors have become very popular in modern infographics. One thing to remember is you want all of your coloration to enhance but also to make sense with all of your information. If you take a look at this map, Sure, it's got some eye-popping color and it's got some contrast, but when you really get down to it, you start to realize that the coloration is entirely arbitrary. There is no reason for the left half of Vardar to be any different than the right half of Vardar in color. When you start to think about this, it can be extremely misleading when you start to assume there is data behind the choices being made here. This is what experts would refer to as chart junk, the unnecessary filler that goes into designing something that has no purpose other than a design gimmick. It's just to be eye catching and it actually confuses the data, if anything. Now, most design elements are somewhere in the gray area of what is chart junk, because someone like Edward Tufte might say that all of these design elements are chart junk, whereas Holmes might say they're clever and eye-catching and user-friendly. So you have to use a bit of discernment, but a good rule of thumb is that you should always have some sort of integral conceptual reason for why you're making your choices. The color should tie into the theme. If you're doing an infographic about chocolate, it would make sense for it to have browns in it. But if you're doing an infographic about the rainbow and color spectrums, you probably wouldn't want it to be mostly chocolate colored. This sort of thing. Make sure that all of your choices are integral to the material, to the data itself. The next thing to consider is hierarchy. Hierarchy is sort of the focal point of an infographic. If we're going back to our elements and principles of design, hierarchy is how you get things to have importance, and you do that through size and scale and color. By giving something more prominence on the page, more size, by giving it more privileged placement, and by giving it colors that pop, you can create hierarchy in the data. And so you can see here, before you even know what this infographic is trying to tell you, you get a sense of what it is about in a general sense. We know it's going to be about the pieces and components of a drivetrain, and we know that the chain and the crankset and the rear derailleur, you can see how much I know about drivetrains, are really important because it's been given hierarchy by its placement on the page and its size. Scale is your biggest friend for creating good hierarchy. Now, the next thing to consider, of course, is once you have established what the most important parts of your data are, the parts that should be biggest and most prominent, you have to consider how you move from one piece to the next. And that has everything to do with eye movement. This is at first a visually fairly compelling infographic. It's got contrast, it's got hierarchy, it certainly has data, but you start to realize you have no idea how to move through this infographic. You probably start somewhere with the diagrams rule, the awkwardly broken up picture at the top, the awkward line breaks here, and then you might move, I don't know, down to the pie chart, and then maybe you're shooting up again through those little bars jutting diagonally, but then you are wanting to go back down to those blue zigzaggy mountain range looking things and then go back up, and then you start to realize, wait, maybe I've missed out on what I should have been reading first, because up in that top left corner is actually the summary of what this diagram is all about, and so then you have to jump up there and you realize you have no idea what order you're supposed to take this information in, and so the information makes much less sense to you. Instead, here's an equally jumbled, equally complicated layout, but it actually has some logical eye movement. It helps that it uses numbers. So your eye automatically is drawn to seeing these circled numbers. You land right in the middle, $3 trillion, and you, because of the color scheme, maybe your eye jumps up to the black, white, and red title, the $3 trillion war, it's cost in 10 steps. So you have an easy idea of what this is going to be about. And then because you see the 4 and the 5 that your eye jumped over to get there, you immediately subconsciously start looking for the 1. And that gives you your starting point down at operational costs here. And then you can follow the lines to 2, to 3, and then up through each of these little diagrams, up through each of these pictures 4, 5, 6, around to the middle, 7, 8, 9, and you find that you're actually moving through in what amounts to a logical way until you get to the end when you finally land up at the top with the summary that goes through the reasoning behind this and the 1 through 10 of all of the points that we just read. It could be improved even still because we start to realize that people like to read top to bottom and left to right, assuming they're raised in a Western English speaking culture. Um, so you can take advantage of that in your eye movement the same way you would in page layout. You can use your design elements to help you move from top to bottom, left to right, um, in this case, ideologically left to right as well. Um, but moving through the page from the top to the bottom, you can see how the arrows and the lines and the placement of the hierarchy of the images allows you to zigzag your way through left to right, top to bottom, in a more linear way. And speaking of linear, a really good tool that a lot of infographics use is this sort of flow chart design where there's a clear path from one to the next. And so here, this is a horizontal linear structure where you start on the left and you just follow this timeline sort of layout um, through each, and then at each node you maybe branch off to the top or the bottom, but you come right back to that main branch and go straight through until you reach the end. And this is a really easy way to direct someone's eye movement by giving them a good anchoring home base to move along. And then the next thing you want to consider is the overall user experience. You could have the best infographic that's designed really well, but if it's either boring or hard to use, you're going to not convey your information. The first thing, it might seem simple, but legibility is an easily overlooked part of the user experience. You may have considered the size of your font in terms of hierarchy, in terms of trying to get the most important information to be the most visible, but did you remember to make sure the least important information is still at least legible? Did you remember to lay it out in a way that actually fits your page? For example, are you trying to put a horizontal image on a vertical scrolling platform? If your infographic is going to exist on the web, it can have an infinitely long vertical layout because you can just keep scrolling and scrolling forever. However, you may not easily be able to get away with an infinitely long horizontal layout without some extra prodding because that's just not the way that we're attuned to using the internet these days, thanks to our mobile phone technology and in fact, social media platforms like Instagram, where you scroll vertically through feeds. Is your type big enough given the platform? Again, think about photos, right? We talked about how if you are building an infographic that's going to be used um, primarily on mobile, you're going to want to make sure that your images are larger because the screen is physically smaller. If this is going to be primarily a desktop experience, then you can get away with more detail and more scrolling and zooming involved. You probably don't want to make the viewer do too many steps in order to take in your information. If they have to start to pinch and scan and move, it's going to be really hard, and you're probably going to give up. And then there is the actual experience of playing within an infographic, sort of an interactive experience. And I've broken this down into 4 types of interactivity, and I'll give you some examples. The first type of interactivity is sort of a novelty or gimmick interaction. This is not to say that it's unnecessary, but it's something that doesn't necessarily have to be there uh, in order to enhance the data itself. It just makes going through the data a more pleasurable experience. For example, this infographic by GE about all of its endeavors around the world, it allows you to scroll around, and wherever you want to go in the world, you can click, and it gives you a little bit of the what's going on in that part of the world that GE is working on. And so you can learn about solar power in Morocco, or uh, whatever you want to learn about here. It's just fun. It's pleasurable to move around. It's not necessarily that it enhances the data, but it allows you to enjoy your experience with the data. The next type of interaction is instructive. And here on Verizon's website, they have a pretty simple and straightforward instructive infographic that teaches you how to use your phone. And so if you want to learn how to take a photo with your new iPhone, you can follow this infographic where you actually get to simulate it. And so now, the next step, press the shutter icon. Press the shutter. Voila, you've completed the steps. Congratulations, you are now an expert photographer. This is probably the simplest, most bare infographic that you could get, but it does do the job, and it has um, the quality of being instructive in its interaction. The next type of interactivity um, is narrative, where you actually may be telling a story, where you walk through that story step by step, depending on the interactions of the viewer. So, for example, the evolution of insight. Use this timeline below to navigate through the decades and learn about the story of market research. This is really good when you're trying to teach someone about something. And so here you can see we kind of scroll through, and at each stopping point, we get a little history lesson. And it's kind of a fun experience here to scroll through. But you would not be able to take in all of this data um, without probably losing your attention span if it weren't for this clever interaction. The important thing to remember when constructing a narrative is that narratives, when they're in the user's control, become atemporal. I can go back in time. And so if you're going to allow me to go back in time, it had better be set up in a way that that doesn't destroy the narrative. Don't want any time traveling here. So assuming you avoid any unnecessary grandfather paradoxes in your narratives, you can get to the end here and you've learned all about the history of insight, the evolution of insight. And the last sort of interactivity I want to talk about is in simulative interaction. Now, before I mention that, I should mention sometimes these types of interactivity are really, really simple. The most basic form of interactivity is clicking and scrolling. Remember that just because it doesn't do anything flashy or using JavaScript and all of this crazy coding doesn't mean it's not interactive. In the same way that all paintings are interactive because you have to interact by looking at them with your eyeballs, or moving around them with your body, all infographics are on some level interactive because you have to take them in some way. You have to access them in some way. So thinking about that is a really important part of the interactive process. A narrative could be as simple as a voiceover, like what I'm doing right now. If there's a way to automate that process where part of your infographic, you click on it and it triggers a voiceover that explains something, that might be a great way to have some narrative interaction. It gives the user some control. All right, so now going to simulative. Simulatives, they simulate real world phenomena. So for example, this is really good for when you have large numbers or things that just don't come across very easily in words or simple pictures. You need more of an experience in order to capture it. For example, how far away is Mars? If the Earth were 100 pixels wide, say about that big, we can take a little journey. The Moon would be 3,000 pixels away. Mars, at its closest, would be, hang on to your space helmets, everyone, You're currently traveling at 7,000 pixels a second, around 3 times the speed of light. Which, if you know anything about Einstein, has made this a very confusing infographic because time should have stopped by now. But at the current state of space technology, it will still take us at least 150 days to get to Mars. Which is why we have to break a lot of rules for space-time travel. The current timeline for a manned mission to Mars is in the 2030s. And as you can see, we start to really get a feel for just how far Mars is because of this simulation, which would be really hard to do if you didn't have the user experience in this interactive way. 428,000 pixels away and only 53 pixels wide, we have our little red planet. And then we can fly all the way back if we wanted to. Which we don't, because that would take forever. Once you have all of this in place, then you should have a fairly well-considered infographic. And so now, lastly, I want to take you to this. I found, I'll link to this after the video in the module, but 7 steps to get started on your infographic. These are coschedule. The website's coschedule offers these 7 steps, and so I want to show how these kind of relate to the process we've just been looking at. And the first step is simply find a topic. Obviously, you need to figure out what fits into your beat, what is worth covering, what you need to use your infographic to accomplish. And then do your research. And that's where the data comes in. This is where you pick out the numbers, all of those how elements that would be better encapsulated through imagery and pictures and experience rather than just pure words. Then that allows you to gather your visual inspiration. You should just look at stuff. Google infographics. Look at infographics. Social media is really great for infographics, and which is why we learn them in the first place, but it's a really great place to look at examples of infographics, see what works, see what's popular, see what gets a lot of hits and a lot of attraction. And then, once you have some ideas, you design your own infographic. And of course, this is where you take the data and you pump it into your inspiration, and you start trying to get it all of the color, hierarchy, eye movement, and user experience working together to best communicate this towards a unified, coherent end. Next, you review for consistency. You make sure all of these pieces are working together. You don't have any chart junk or any outliers or anything confusing the data. Most infographics will add a call to action or credits at the end. That is a good way to even circumvent all of the writing that you have to do in your article by being able to just put a call to action saying where you got your information from and where viewers can go to get more information, what you want viewers to do now that they've learned all of this stuff from your infographic, how to get them to launch forward into the future. And lastly, you publish and share. So I hope that is helpful to you, and I hope you make some killer infographics with all of these pieces in place working well.